Chapter 17 of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Patrick Wallace. The last day. When I awoke, Thursday 2nd October, and hearing a great flourishing of cocks and chuckling of contented hens, betook me to the window of the clean and comfortable room where I had slept the night, I looked forth on a sunshiny morning in a deep vale of chestnut gardens. It was still early, and the cock crows and the slanting lights and the long shadows encouraged me to be out and look round me. Saint-Germain-de-Calberte is a great parish, 9 leagues round about. At the period of the wars, and immediately before the devastation, it was inhabited by 275 families, of which only 9 were Catholic, and it took the curé 17 September days to go from house to house on horseback for a census. But the place itself, although capital of a canton, is scarce larger than a hamlet. It lies terraced across a steep slope in the midst of mighty chestnuts. The Protestant chapel stands below upon a shoulder. In the midst of the town is the quaint old Catholic church. It was here that poor Du Chayla, the Christian martyr, kept his library, and held a court of missionaries. Here he had built his tomb, thinking to lie among a grateful population whom he had redeemed from error. And hither on the morrow of his death they brought the body, pierced with 52 wounds, to be interred. Clad in his priestly robes, he was laid out in state in the church. The curé, taking his text from 2 Samuel, 20th chapter and 12th verse, and Amasa wallowed in his blood in the highway, preached a rousing sermon, and exhorted his brethren to die each at his post, like their unhappy and illustrious superior. In the midst of this eloquence there came a breeze that Spirit Séguier was near at hand, and behold, all the assembly took to their horses' heels, some east, some west, and the curé himself as far as Alais. Strange was the position of this little Catholic metropolis, a thimbleful of Rome, in such a wild and contrary neighbourhood. On the one hand, the Legion of Salomon overlooked it from Casognos. On the other, it was cut off from assistance by the Legion of Roland at Mialet. The curé, Louvre-le-Nil, although he took a panic at the archpriest's funeral and so hurriedly decamped to Alais, stood well by his isolated pulpit, and thence uttered fulminations against the crimes of the Protestants. Salomon besieged the village for an hour and a half, but was beaten back. The militiamen on guard before the curé's door could be heard in the black hours singing Protestant psalms and holding friendly talk with the insurgents. And in the morning, although not a shot had been fired, there would not be a round of powder in their flasks. Where was it gone? All handed over to the Camisards for a consideration. Untrusty guardians for an isolated priest. That these continual stirs were once busy in Saint-Germain-de-Calberte, the imagination with difficulty receives. All is now so quiet, the pulse of human life now beats so low and still in this hamlet of the mountains. Boys followed me a great way off, like a timid sort of lion hunters, and people turned round to have a second look, or came out of their houses as I went by. My passage was the first event, you would have fancied, since the Camisards. There was nothing rude or forward in this observation. It was but a pleased and wondering scrutiny, like that of oxen or the human infant. Yet it wearied my spirits, and soon drove me from the street. I took refuge on the terraces, which are here greenly carpeted with sward, and tried to imitate with a pencil the inimitable attitudes of the chestnuts as they bear up their canopy of leaves. Ever and again a little wind went by, and the nuts dropped all around me with a light and dull sound upon the sward. The noise was as of a thin fall of great hailstones, but there went with it a cheerful human sentiment of an approaching harvest and farmers rejoicing in their gains. Looking up, I could see the brown nut peering through the husk, which was already gaping, and between the stems the eye embraced an amphitheatre of hill, sunlit and green with leaves. I have not often enjoyed a place more deeply. I moved in an atmosphere of pleasure, and felt light and quiet and content. But perhaps it was not the place alone that so disposed my spirit. Perhaps some one was thinking of me in another country, or perhaps some thought of my own had come and gone unnoticed, and yet done me good. For some thoughts, which sure would be the most beautiful, vanish before we can rightly scan their features, as though a god travelling by our green highways should but ope the door, give one smiling look into the house, and go again for ever. Was it Apollo, or Mercury, or Love with folded wings? Who shall say? But we go the lighter about our business, and feel peace and pleasure in our hearts. I dined with a pair of Catholics. They agreed in the condemnation of a young man, a Catholic, who had married a Protestant girl and gone over to the religion of his wife. A Protestant born they could understand and respect. Indeed, they seemed to be of the mind of an old Catholic woman who told me that same day there was no difference between the two sects, save that wrong was more wrong for the Catholic, who had more light and guidance. But this of a man's desertion filled them with contempt. "It's a bad idea for a man to change," said one. It may have been accidental, but you see how this phrase pursued me. And for myself, I believe it is the current philosophy in these parts. I have some difficulty in imagining a better. It's not only a great flight of confidence for a man to change his creed and go out of his family for heaven's sake, but the odds are, nay, and the hope is, that with all this great transition in the eyes of man, he has not changed himself a hairbreadth to the eyes of God. Honour to those who do so, for the wrench is sore, but it argues something narrow, whether of strength or weakness, whether of the prophet or the fool, in those who can take a sufficient interest in such infinitesimal and human operations, or who can quit a friendship for a doubtful process of the mind. And I think I should not leave my old creed for another, changing only words for other words, but by some brave reading embrace it in spirit and truth, and find wrong as wrong for me as for the best of other communions. The phylloxera was in the neighbourhood, and instead of wine we drank at dinner a more economical juice of the grape, la Parisienne they call it. It is made by putting the fruit whole into a cask with water. One by one the berries ferment and burst. What is drunk during the day is supplied at night in water. So, with ever another pitcher from the well, and ever another grape exploding and giving out its strength, one cask of Parisienne may last a family till spring. It is, as the reader will anticipate, a feeble beverage, but very pleasant to the taste. What with dinner and coffee, it was long past 3 before I left Saint-Germain-de-Calberte. I went down beside the Gardon of Mialet, a great glaring watercourse devoid of water, and through Saint-Étienne-de-Vallée-Française, or Val Francesque as they used to call it, and towards evening began to ascend the hill of Saint-Pierre. It was a long and steep ascent. Behind me, an empty carriage returning to Saint-Jean-du-Gard kept hard upon my tracks, and near the summit overtook me. The driver, like the rest of the world, was sure I was a pedlar, but unlike others he was sure of what I had to sell. He had noticed the blue wool which hung out of my pack at either end, and from this he had decided, beyond my power to alter his decision, that I dealt in blue wool collars, such as decorate the neck of the French draught horse. I had hurried to the topmost powers of Modestine, for I dearly desired to see the view upon the other side before the day had faded. But it was night when I reached the summit. The moon was riding high and clear, and only a few grey streaks of twilight lingered in the west. A yawning valley, gulfed in blackness, lay like a hole in created nature at my feet. But the outline of the hills was sharp against the sky. There was Mount Egoal, the stronghold of Castanet. And Castanet, not only as an active undertaking leader, deserves some mention among Camisards, for there is a spray of rose among his laurel. And he showed how, even in a public tragedy, love will have its way. In the high tide of war he married, in his mountain citadel, a young and pretty lass called Mariette. There were great rejoicings, and the bridegroom released 25 prisoners in honour of the glad event. 7 months afterwards, Mariette, the Princess of the Cevennes, as they called her in derision, fell into the hands of the authorities, where it was like to have gone hard with her. But Castanet was a man of execution and loved his wife. He fell on Valleraugue, and got a lady there for a hostage; and for the first and last time in that war there was an exchange of prisoners. Their daughter, pledge of some starry night upon Mount Aigoal, has left descendants to this day. Modestine and I, it was our last meal together, had a snack upon the top of Saint Pierre, I on a heap of stones, she standing by me in the moonlight, and decorously eating bread out of my hand. The poor brute would eat more heartily in this manner, for she had a sort of affection for me, which I was soon to betray. It was a long descent upon Saint-Jean-du-Gard, and we met no one but a carter, visible afar off by the glint of the moon on his extinguished lantern. Before 10 o'clock we had got in and were at supper. 15 miles and a stiff hill in little beyond 6 hours. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Patrick Wallace. Farewell, Modestine. On examination, on the morning of October 3rd, Modestine was pronounced unfit for travel. She would need at least 2 days' repose, according to the ostler. But I was now eager to reach Alais for my letters, and being in a civilized country of stagecoaches, I determined to sell my lady friend and be off by the diligence that afternoon. Our yesterday's march, with the testimony of the driver who had pursued us up the long hill of Saint-Pierre, spread a favourable notion of my donkey's capabilities. Intending purchasers were aware of an unrivalled opportunity. Before 10 I had an offer of 25 francs, and before noon, after a desperate engagement, I sold her, saddle and all, for 35. The pecuniary gain is not obvious, but I had bought freedom into the bargain. Saint-Jean-du-Gard is a large place and largely Protestant. The maire, a Protestant, asked me to help him in a small matter which is itself characteristic of the country. The young women of the Cevennes profit by the common religion and the difference of the language to go largely as governesses into England; and here was one, a native of Mialet, struggling with English circulars from 2 different agencies in London. I gave what help I could, and volunteered some advice, which struck me as being excellent. One thing more I note. The phylloxera has ravaged the vineyards in this neighbourhood, and in the early morning, under some chestnuts by the river, I found a party of men working with a cider press. I could not at first make out what they were after, and asked one fellow to explain. "Making cider," he said. "Oui, c'est comme ça, comme dans le Nord." There was a ring of sarcasm in his voice. The country was going to the devil. It was not until I was fairly seated by the driver and rattling through a rocky valley with dwarf olives that I became aware of my bereavement. I had lost Modestine. Up to that moment I had thought I hated her. But now she was gone. And oh, the difference to me! For 12 days we had been fast companions. We had travelled upwards of 120 miles, crossed several respectable ridges, and jogged along with our 6 legs by many a rocky and many a boggy by-road. After the first day, although sometimes I was hurt and distant in manner, I still kept my patience. And as for her, poor soul, she had come to regard me as a god. She loved to eat out of my hand. She was patient, elegant in form, the colour of an ideal mouse, and inimitably small. Her faults were those of her race and sex, her virtues were her own. Farewell, and if for ever. Father Adam wept when he sold her to me. After I had sold her in my turn, I was tempted to follow his example; and being alone, with a stage driver and 4 or 5 agreeable young men, I did not hesitate to yield to my emotion. End of chapter 18. End of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes.